In this lecture, Dr. Tom Rudel presents two examples of the use of spatial methods to understand difference and stratification in human impacts on the landscape. He presents one example of suburban sprawl in New Jersey and discusses the use of geospatial data and spatial regression to characterize stratification in development patterns. He then presents a second example of land use change in agricultural management in Ecuador. He describes the research questions and the process of combining remote sensing data with household surveys and interviews to understand the drivers of difference in tree cover in pasture lands. He uses the example to illustrate how to interpret spatial stratification in the social and natural context within which it occurs.
What we're going to be talking about for the next hour or so is basically spatial analyses of landscape changes and in heavily intervened landscapes. In other words, in one case we're going to be looking at a suburbanizing landscape in northern New Jersey, and in the second instance we're going to be looking at an area of active cattle ranching in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And what unites these two presentations are, one, some methods. So they're going to be these are going to be spatial regression analyses. In addition to that, we're going to be looking at processes of socioeconomic inequality as they emerge in these landscapes. And what you'll see are a couple of illustrations about how you can basically use spatial regression techniques to get at the dimensions of these inequalities. So with that as an introduction, the first thing we're going to do, the first analysis is going to come from New Jersey. And basically what we're going to be using here is almost exclusively human data to trace out a set of changes in landscapes that have some pretty important implications, I think, for GHG emissions. So it's an analysis of a change in human society which has some pretty large environmental consequences, I think. The second analysis involves a somewhat different set of data. Again, we're going to be looking at inequalities as they emerge in these landscapes, and it's a quite different process. It's a greening process, a re-emerging secondary forest process that we're going to be looking at. So we're going to be talking about sprawl, and sprawl is a low-density commercial or residential pattern of settlement where people rely exclusively on automobiles for getting around. So the important distinction in substantively in this analysis is the basic change or evolution from what was middle-class sprawl to what is upper-class sprawl over time. Here's some dates on middle-class sprawl. So think split levels if you're thinking middle-class sprawl. If you're thinking upper-class sprawl, think mega mansions. And the point is that historically, at least in New Jersey, but elsewhere as well, we've gone from one to the other. And so one of the things that we attempted to do in this study is trace out the socioeconomic and GHG emission implications of this change in the patterns of sprawl. And so here's the setting for the study is this barred area. It's referred to sometimes as the New Jersey Highlands. It's the first range of the Appalachians coming in from the coastal plain. The data analysis relies on two sources of data. One is cadasters, which are basically property. They are a record of the properties and who owns them in a particular in a community. They're kept by communities. They're kept by communities for tax purposes, and they can be digitized. Okay, so what you're looking at here is a digitized, meaning a spatialized, map-made version of a cadaster for one particular town. So what we did is these cadasters have been created for all of the communities in this area. They pretty much, at least in the United States, most municipalities now have digitized their cadasters, okay? So our goal here was to figure out, amongst other things, what the land use regulations were, and in particular, how much land was required to build a home, okay? This has direct impacts on the cost of the home. So it matters a lot in terms of the size of the home, what the developer decides to build, whether or not he needs 5 acres to build, or 2 acres to build, or a quarter acre to build, okay? The other thing we did here is we mapped out acquisitions of open space over about a 35-year period. So this involved digitizing the the particular tracts of land that went into open space, attaching dates to when this was done, and then trying to figure out whether or not there were any changes in real estate development during these particular periods of time. So we traced out changes in the land tenure, which is essentially what we're talking about when a piece of land goes from farmland to open space. A change in tenure, and we wanted to relate that to changes in real estate development. And we were able to do that through this pretty laborious process of digitizing these cadastres. Then we merged this kind of data with census data for the Highlands region, for each of the communities in the Highlands region. So the unit of analysis, it varies some, but the primary unit of analysis in the data that I'm going to present is the community. There's 83 of them. In addition to the digitizing, there's a history that one wants to compile in a particular place about when were the real estate developments, what kinds of deals were done, what were part of the deals, and as it turned in, we'll talk about that in a second. But here's a set of characteristics about the region, the 83 community region. And so a couple things to note here. First of all, minimum lot areas between the 70s and 2002 basically doubled in size. So you need 1.5 acres in the 1970s. By the 2002, you need 3 acres. Okay, so the minimum lot areas are going up. This is a change in the regulations. Okay, the amount of preserved open space in the area expands tremendously during this period, from about 7.5% to about a little bit less than 30% of all the land in the region. At the same time, the increases in minimum lot area and open space tend to occur in the same places, same communities. We'll talk about that in a sec. And median family incomes in the Highlands, this 83 community region, are diverging from the rest of the U.S. This place is becoming a more exclusive region to live in during the course of this 30 to 35 year period. And house prices, not surprisingly, jump. This reflects, amongst other things, a change in the composition of what's being built. The mega mansions are having an impact on the average house prices. Okay, so that's sort of region-wide kinds of trends. So one of the things that's kind of interesting and curious about things is that the growth of open space happens to occur in the same place that the real estate development is occurring. So what's happening here? This emerged out of interviews, but basically every time a developer wants to build in this area, he's confronted with a basically fairly hostile set of people on the Land Use Planning Commission who don't want to allow any more development because, after all, we already live here. And more development means a less exclusive community, and heaven forbid, we just don't want that stuff. So the only way the developer can get permission to build is by taking most of that, a good part of that tract of land that he now has permission to build on, and granting it to the community. Okay, so there's a quid pro quo with every real estate development in this kind of setting. Give the town 100 acres of open space, and you can build if you've got a 300-acre tract, and you can build on the other 200 acres. Okay, so this has real consequences for the landscapes and for the ecology of the landscapes. So here's one particular deal. This block of land here was originally a Boy Scout preserve. Boy Scouts sold it to AT&T. AT&T wanted to put a heliport in there and build a corporate complex. The neighbors said no. That was the end of that story. They sold it to a developer. The developer wanted to put expensive homes in. That first developer went bankrupt. Then he sold it to another developer. Second developer, and meanwhile, there's community opposition to all of this. Second developer eventually starts negotiating with the opposition and gets a deal where he's allowed to build homes on 180 acres of this 570-acre plot of land. And so he chooses this particular area for his homes and then puts subdivision roads in so that every home that he builds of the 180 or, no, it wasn't 180, 80 or so, backs on this new preserve, okay? So the preserve, 180 acres gets built on, 350 or 60 becomes a preserve that he gives to the town, and every one of the homes that he builds backs on the preserve, which of course is a nice selling price. So you can think of the implications of this for fragmentation in terms of habitats, amongst other things. Okay. So most studies of sprawl show tremendous fragmentation in the environmental habitats, and it's in part because of this kind of process. So one of the things that's sort of interesting about this kind of setting is, well, within this 83 community area, is it the case that the wealthiest communities, some of which are extremely wealthy, in fact have the biggest minimum lot areas and the most open space, are generally speaking the most exclusive places to live in those communities? Well, we did some spatial regressions, which involved some basically modeling spillover effects. Okay, you need to, for those of you who haven't done them, you need to create a shape file, which it goes with the data set, and is literally a map of every unit of analysis in the regression that you're doing. And you tie all of these quantitative measures to that particular location of those communities, and you can chart or capture the magnitude of spillovers from one community to another, which is a sort of keep up with the Joneses. Oh my God, those guys over there, they put in 10-acre zoning. We've got to do the same thing. Otherwise, who knows who will move in here? So we did a spatial regression here, and one of the emerging things that emerged out of the spatial regression is that the median family income didn't explain the amount of open space in a community, the change in the amount of open space, and median house value didn't either. So and the same thing when you do the change in minimum lot areas, same problem, same thing, same results. Basically, median family income doesn't explain anything, and nor does house value change. So what this is telling us is that basically this idea of stratification within these 83 communities, it's not going on. The 83 communities are stratifying from the rest of the region, but basically within the 83 communities, it's keep up with the Joneses. The wealthiest communities may be setting some sort of standard, but the poorer communities, and poorer in very relative terms, are keeping up with these wealthier communities. It happens in a clustered sort of way. So, as you might expect, with this kind of imitative, this is a Weberian kind of process. So these folks put in 10-acre zoning, well then these folks feel compelled to do that. And these folks too. And this is not an accident, because what happened here was a big land fight. All this upzoning, as you might want to refer to it, increasing the minimum lot areas, happens right after the government finally wins, the federal government finally wins a big court fight that allows them to complete this section of 78, which allows commutes from these places to the center city. Okay? So development pressure goes up, and the response is, oh my God, we can't allow that stuff in here. Let's put in some really draconian minimum lot areas. But it's clustered, okay? Which is, again, this imitative sort of process. What does this do to the spatial distribution of social classes? Well, basically, classical middle-class sprawl separates the lower classes from the middle and upper classes. That's the 1955 to 1985. That's the reaction to the race riots, whites moving out of cities like Newark. So that segregates the lower classes from the middle and upper classes. Upper class sprawl segregates the upper class from the rest of the population. So that's a fairly significant difference in class terms. The other thing that's interesting, here's where the GHG emissions come in, is that if you look at this as a map of new housing units in New Jersey over a 35-year period. So the interesting thing is, so we've got data from 1994, 95, 2001, 2002, and then 2006, 2007. So the lower bar here is 1994, 1995, and here's the pattern here in terms of new construction is pretty much the typical post-World War II suburbanization patterns. Most of the new units are coming in the suburbs, 70% of them. The center cities have virtually nothing. Well, less than 20, around 20% of the new units are in the center cities. The center cities here are basically Jersey City, Newark, Elizabeth, a few other places. And then rural areas, these two counties out here, relatively small percentages on the order of 12 or 14%. So sort of fast forward to 2006, 2007, what you find is that the suburban new units are now about 40%, okay? The urban units are now close to 60%, okay? And the rural and fringe area is a very small minority. So what's happened is that new construction is all of a sudden now concentrating in the urban core. And you can ask, well, why is that? Well, part of it is that these areas have experienced what is referred to as build-out. There's been so much open space conserved that the large builders, Toll Brothers being the classic example, I don't know if they operate here in the Maryland area. Anyway, they can't assemble tracts of land and build on them anymore. They're just literally, the regulations are too restrictive, the land use regulations. They can't build enough homes on the amounts of land that they can require. So they think they're still mass producers. So they're going to go to the one place they can produce a large number of units, which is going to be the center cities. And so Jersey City, Toll Brothers is operating in Jersey City. They're operating in Brooklyn. So there's been a refocus in terms of new housing units. So you might say, well, what does this mean in terms of GA? There's a couple of interesting implications here. One is GHG emissions. This is smart growth, forcing people to live in densely populated areas. But it's only smart growth for the middle and lower classes. And there's some interesting gentrification, unfortunate gentrification implications here. Because now you have the middle class competing with the lower classes for new in these areas where the new housing is being built in places like Jersey City or Newark. So what we did here was we created a GIS. The working tool here is a GIS, which we then use to do the spatial regressions. And but it's only using human data with some interesting environmental implications sort of tagged on to the end. Okay? So that's one study. So the second piece of analysis, this is again a spatial. It's a very different place, very different set of actors, somewhat different set of issues, and there's again a green aspect of this analysis. And actually, I'm going to focus on that because the reading was more focused on the stratification dimension of it. So this is in the Ecuadorian Amazon, and it's about the spontaneous emergence of silvopastoral landscapes. So think pastures, so think a heavily intervened kind of landscape, not pristine at all. So place, we're talking about, this is Ecuador, we're talking about this particular region. Peru's down here. So the Andes are right here. So this is right on the edge of the Amazon basin. And we studied 4 communities here, all of them cattle ranch, all of them settled originally as cattle ranching communities. Okay, so if the unit of analysis in the prior piece of work was a community, here the units of analysis are households, but they're broken out into 4 different communities. 3 of these 4 communities are mestizo, meaning mixed race kinds of people from the highlands. The 4th community, Santa Isabel, is a Shuar community. Shuar are an Amerindian group, populous Amerindian group, about 80,000 people who inhabit this, historically have inhabited this portion of the Ecuadorian Amazon. This is a piece of pasture. This area is incredibly scenic when it's not raining. So here's a volcano, Sangay, for those of you who know volcanoes in the Andes. Interestingly enough, nobody has any questions about climate change in this place, because they can all see the snow basically disappearing on the glaciers on the volcanoes. So this is looking in one direction, back up into the Andes, and this is looking in another direction, north. So it's really kind of you're down in the high plains of the Amazon basin, but you're real close to the mountains. And it rains all the time. So this is a luxuriant vegetation. So this is a full, these are mature pasture grasses. So it's about up to here on me. So I can't see where I'm going on when it's ready for the cows. Okay, it's an area populated by Shuar, as I mentioned earlier. This is a Shuar homestead in a rainforest. Okay, but it was invaded by colonists, okay? Beginning about in the 1960s with Development Bank support from the Inter-American Development Bank, they put fronted monies to build roads into this area from the Andes. And this is an example of some colonists from the highlands who are crossing a river, the Zamora River, on a taravita, a kind of cable. Okay, so this is here's the wire up there. Here's the rope that they're being hauled across on. They're sitting on a T-bar like thing. So that's how one got across rivers in that particular locale. So it was, conditions were kind of, moving into this area, conditions were tough. And of course, what immediately happened was the Shuar and the Mestizos there was conflict that emerged between them. But anyway, in part because of the mediating role of Salesian priests, and I won't go into that, but Amerindians hung on to about 40% of the land in this area, and about 60% ended up in the hands of the mestizos. So, the question we're interested in here is a large amount of this land was almost immediately converted into pasture. In other words, deforested and turned into pasture lands for cows. Okay, because cows are the cash crop in this area, or were, and still largely are. So one thing to note about the pastures is this is a shot of a pasture in about 1969. Okay, just this area you can see it here, but this is all pasture here. Okay, and this is forested. Now you're down here in the river basin. The riverbed. But the thing to note about this pasture is the relative absence of trees. Okay, people clear-cut largely because they were worried about trees falling on cows. Once they put cows, storms come along, trees land on their cows, that's the end of that investment. And these are big investments because we're talking about people who were landless before they came down into this area. So the norm was really clear-cut. So this is what a pasture looks like in 2009. So a couple of things to just but the key thing to note here is, so this is all pasture over here. This is also pasture here. It's just been recently eaten by cows. And so what you're looking at here is the brown stubble. Okay? And the key thing to note here is that this is pasture too. So there's a lot of trees in this pasture. Okay? And not so many over here. So what the study ended up being was, okay, why so many trees in these kinds of pastures and not so many here? How can we wanted to distinguish between households and try to figure out why more trees in some pastures and less trees in other pastures. And furthermore, because we're ambitious and we're willing to be risky about our ideas, we were wondering if we could use this kind of cross-sectional difference to make some sort of longitudinal argument. Questionable, but we tried. So the key issue here is, all right, how do we differentiate between these pastures that have lots of trees and these pastures that, like this one, and these pastures that don't have many trees at all? Well, and why should we care about this? Well, we should care about it for a variety of reasons. One is that grasslands and pastures are a huge part of the landscape. They are the most common human landscape. And one of the questions is, do pastures with trees sequester significantly more carbon? How much, if so? If so, how much? And then, is there more plant and animal biodiversity? And so the more general question is, okay, so what's the magnitude of the environmental services that come with the transition from a pastoral to a silvopastoral kind of landscape? And so we collected quite a wide array of data here. One thing is we went around and interviewed the owners of a set of farms, okay, Shuar as well as colonists. We collected a lot of ecological data, so something about the numbers of trees in a particular plot of land, the size of the trees. We did soil samples to get at the below ground carbon. So a lot of different kinds of data collection. And included in this data collection was remote sensing, including high resolution remote sensing. So one of the big advances is, at least in this line of work, is the availability or recent availability of very high resolution remote sensing. So now you can get what was spy data that the spy agencies used 15 years ago, you can now get pretty much for a very minimal cost. It's 3 or 4 meter resolution data. Okay, so what we did was we went and interviewed people in a particular farm. Then they did sketch maps of their boundaries, and they were wildly inaccurate, which is interesting in and of itself. But then we charted basically where their farms were. So we had spatial data on the farms as well as social data on the farms. And we had carbon data on what was going on in their pastures. And then some biodiversity data too. So we put that into a GIS, all right, and crunched the numbers. But we had a little bit of theory here. So there's one notion is that this is an area of significant outmigration, old colonization zones. People leave them and go to places like cities, go overseas. So this is a sending region for people going to Westchester, New York, and to Madrid. And so one argument was, well, you know what's going on here with these silvopastoral landscapes? People are just moving out, and there's an absence of labor, so they're letting the trees grow. So that's one sort of argument. It's kind of a hollow frontier argument. It's more of a Marxist kind of thing. Then the other sort of argument, it actually is one that comes from Robert McNetting, an anthropologist. And his idea is essentially that you're going to get sustainable kinds of landscapes or agricultural practiced in those places which have considerable labor surpluses. Okay, fairly large families. And this is a general argument about the ecological, about small-scale sustainable agriculture and sort of the ecology of it, if you want to call it that. Okay, so we talked to farmers. We asked them, well, why are you leaving some trees? Why are you leaving trees in your pastures? And we got a bunch of answers. Some involving shade for cattle, some involving it's a way of refertilizing the pastures, and some, as I think Elizabeth was saying, about a new stream of income from the lumber, because it only takes 15, with this kind of luxuriant landscape, in 15 years you can have some trees that are big enough now that you can sell them to a sawmill to make furniture, okay? And so the average income in this place is around, smaller farms, probably $4,000 to $5,000 a year. So you don't have to sell too many of these trees before you've got a significant increment in your income. Okay, so then we crunch some numbers, and this is again a spatial regression. Here we've got locations for the farms, and there's a spillover effect. Not surprisingly, it's like, oh yeah, look at what the neighbors are doing. They're leaving trees there. Maybe we should, and those are cedars that they're leaving. So we should be doing the same thing. So if a cedar comes up, cedar's a fairly valuable piece of wood, then leave it, okay? So when you're out there cleaning the pasture, cleaning out the malezas, the weeds, whatever, just leave the cedars, leave some of the less valuable woods. Plywood, for instance, they're not plywood. Balsa is a very common secondary forest tree there. So in balsa, I don't know if you've seen it, but you can use balsa for all kinds of little figurines and things like that. So those kinds of woods would get preserved. So a couple of things show up here. First of all, inconsistent with the netting kind of argument, it's households with a considerable amount, with some labor surpluses who are leaving trees in their forests. Okay? So this is not oh God, there's no labor here. It's not a labor scarcity argument, allowing trees to grow because there's nobody to go out and get rid of them. It's rather a labor surplus kind of argument. There are people going out to change the cows every 12 hours or so, and they are deciding to leave trees. And furthermore, it's younger, in particular, younger people who are doing that. So these are households where there's older adults, but there's younger people, and it's the younger people who are doing this sort of thing. Now it turns out that the parcel size, so it's places with bigger parcels that are allowing silvopastoral landscapes to emerge, but within those bigger parcels, they have less land in pasture. So these are people whose income stream from cattle is probably less than on the average. And so this comes back to the point about lumber as an additional stream of income here, okay? It's a way of producing more in the way of income. But part of the issue with the Shuar is they can't go to banks because they're not allowed to buy and sell their land. The bank can't possess it as collateral for a loan, so they can't get access to the capital, whereas the mestizos can because they've got the capital coming in from overseas and they can also go to banks. So the idea of Shuar building cattle, that's just not going to happen. Building cattle herds through loans is just not going to happen. And in part it's because of the unusual tenure that they have.